Good morning.
Hey, good to see you. I wish you were feeling better. I can
Thanks.
relate to not having felt too good earlier this month.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely not just me. I feel like a lot of the country is sick with a lot of things right now, or at least my community is. So, and I know you have been sick too. So, happy to
Yeah,
be here though.
yeah, me too. It was so strange because I was on vacation earlier this month and it was such a restful vacation. Like the naps I took,
Oh,
like my spouse like would wake up in the morning sometimes before me, and usually I'm up hours before him, and he was like, "Is she okay? Like what's happening here?" But like I was just adjusting, and so it was so strange to then get like a really bad cold at the end of vacation because I
yeah.
usually associate getting colds with like when I'm doing too much and my
Uh-huh.
nervous system is like, we need to go into dorsal vagal shutdown
Yep.
kind of stuff. So it was like so interesting. And then it took me so long to get better because I'm in this new job and like my routine is different. So the struggle is real.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, this is one of the ways, like when I have not been listening to my body,
Mm-hmm.
illness is what happens. And it's like we've been gently knocking for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're
Mm-hmm.
just busting down the door, and it is what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had COVID like 3 or 4 weeks ago, and now this sinus infection. So I'm like, got it, message received. Okay, I'm gonna like start taking this seriously. Oh, and so the cycle goes.
Yeah.
Emotionally, it is right.
I felt like I was in that cycle for years. And I feel like the pandemic interrupted it,
Yeah.
partly because I think I was working from home. I was wearing masks a lot. In, at different times, I was less stressed. But it's interesting. I'm gonna have to be more aware now of like what are the ways I'm listening to the ways that my body tells me it needs to relax or shut down, and even like simple things. Like so now I have like a 50-ish minute commute now that each way. And so I'm even trying to figure out like what do I do in that commute? Like
Uh-huh.
what are the ways I care for myself? So last week I figured out I can listen to an audiobook or podcast in the morning and I have to listen to music after work. Like and it's just those little things of like caring for oneself or at least for me it's a version of rest. It's like the morning I'm like I'm with it and I'm one of those who just gets up and goes. But after work I need to like metabolize or check out or make the transition in some sort of way. So I really have it took me I feel like almost my whole life to figure out like how do I listen to my body and my nervous system at like low dosages before it starts to scream at me.
Exactly, right before it just starts breaking down.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. But I like how what you're talking about in terms of being really deliberate about rest and expansive about the idea of rest. Because I think I've been analyzing like what happened. Like I was doing so great with taking good care of myself and like moving in the world at a slower pace. And I'm like, April happened. That's what happened. And then it's just like April
Mm,
through August is bananas. But what I do is I start to then squeeze myself and caring for myself into the crevices of my life rather than that's the foundation of my life. That's what
mm,
makes things work.
mm,
And then I start falling into all of these white Western ideas about self care, where I'm like, well, rest is just silence and solitude. So as long as I'm meditating and journaling and doing some yoga, it's okay. But like, that's pretending like community doesn't matter. That's pretending like deep
mm,
connection doesn't matter. That's pretending like fun doesn't matter.
mm.
Um, and I start, and that's the only way I think about it. So I start ignoring my body too. And I'm like, well, I'm doing yoga. So this pain in my neck that's been there for months, it'll eventually go away, right? And I start to like
Mhm.
really emphasize the mind and like start to neglect the body, or I squeeze the self-care of the
Mm,
body again into crevices rather than it being foundational.
mm.
And that's when the problems begin. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. I think for me, I've been trying to figure out what are different kinds of rest. I
yeah,
remember reading an article at some point earlier this year, not this week, this year, that said there were like, I don't know, 6 or 8 different kinds of rest, which I don't know if I had ever really thought about it before that article about like rest means not just like sleeping, right? Not just doing nothing, but like I've been trying to do like a restorative yoga practice. Like I've been trying to do it once every 2 weeks, but really trying to get back to a once a week practice because there's something about that kind of rest. Well, I'm
yeah,
still awake, but like I'm supporting my body with props, like that's the kind of rest, like, or just like trying to listen to music again, like
yeah.
that can be a type of rest, or even like I've found like in the first few weeks of this new job that that I couldn't watch anything heavy at night. Like, um, so I was been rewatching Suits, which has been on Netflix, and
Oh,
like it's one of my
cool.
favorite shows. And it's one of those like I've watched it before, but it's still engaging. But my brain like couldn't process. I like dramas, so like my brain couldn't process
Yeah,
anything intense, and like that's a form of rest. So like encouraging us to think about like the different kinds of rest because
yeah,
like yeah, if we're living a life, there's going to be so many things that are going to pull at us, right? And like you had talked about how like April, May is like the tension point for you, like the stressful, and for me, like September, like that's like I
uh,
look at it coming, like my kids start school next Wednesday, and
I
like
see.
for years that has been like like especially working in like a university calendar, it's like
Oh,
the back to
sure.
school for the students, the back to
Yeah,
school for my kids, the change in rhythm from like the ease or slowness
right.
of the summer to like
Yeah.
the like how do I help care for all these people's needs? So I'm trying really hard to think about like how can I go into September with some ease? What do I
Yeah.
have to say no to? What do I have to just like make myself be unapologetic about slowing down, even if the world is getting faster and
Yeah,
more demanding?
absolutely. I love thinking about the different kinds of rest. I can't remember if Cole Arthur Riley, she's do you know Cole Arthur Riley?
I just read her book last week. Like
Right?
literally. This Year Flesh?
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
Oh
That's
my
so
God.
funny. We didn't even talk about this ahead of
No, we
time.
didn't. I don't think we've ever talked about her in the past either.
I don't think so either. Yeah.
Oh my God. I read her around this time last year and I just pulled it back off the shelf with Rest is Resistance. But Cole Arthur, you might be able to tell me this because I can't remember if she talked about it or if it was like a light bulb moment that I had based on her talking about rest. But she talks about, or I don't know, I think she talks about rest in love. This
Mm,
idea of like resting in love. And for me, again, this rest has always been something that I've thought about in this like very narrow way where I'm like, I'm sleeping, I'm meditating, I'm journaling, I'm journaling. Um, but when I was reading her book, it was a reminder, and I need this reminder now, that people, safe people that I love, that love me exactly as I am, where I don't have to like mask or fake it. Here come the tears. That is rest too. And how much I've let that slide because I wish it was just April and May. I think I convinced myself it's just April and May. It's all of baseball season. Baseball parents, I see you. It's all of baseball season, and baseball is April through October.
mm,
Really, fall ball's better, but like it leaves no room for anything else. And so it's such an inconvenience for me, for my family, for the systems to like schedule time with friends on a Saturday
mhm.
morning for brunch, on a Friday night. Like it would be such an inconvenience that I was like, oh, fuck it. Like I have to, there's so many hoops to jump through that I'm like, I just can't. It's only 8 weeks. That's bullshit, but I convince myself it's only 8 weeks.
Sure.
And then I can just like white knuckle it. And then
Right.
I go months without seeing friends. And then I wind up like exhausted and sad. And I'm like, what? This is dumb. Like, look at how things have been. It's so right. Different kinds of rest, resting in love that are who are the people that our nervous systems get to like just be at ease around. And I forget that.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember we used to have soccer in the fall. That was also part of the stress, is like both kids played soccer. So that on
Yeah.
the weekend, sometimes we would go to like 4 soccer games in a weekend, and it was
Yep.
like, but it didn't last as long as baseball season. So at least like that. So like I was so excited when my kids stopped playing like travel soccer and like other, like it just freed up the weekends, which I guess was last year. That was the first year we didn't. So I'm like trying to wonder about like when you do have, especially like if you're a parent or have these obligations that are intensive and like you're caring for your kid by supporting them in these activities, how do you incorporate rest? How do you still get to have like these relationships? How do they get nourished or nurtured in
Um,
those time periods? Because there is only so much time, and yet, you know, I'm hearing from you that your system needs those relationships and that connection.
yeah. Yeah. Totally. And that's the other thing I've been thinking about is like what facilitates rest and healing and what gets in the way. Certainly a
Mhm.
family and children and all the obligations that come with parenting get in the way. But I've also been thinking a lot about money and how much money do I actually need? Because I think I have this old narrative that comes from past generations of scarcity and poverty and this hustle, this need to constantly be hustling. And I think I really need to keep breaking that down a little bit because that's definitely something that for me gets in the way of rest. Like even when I carve out all this time for myself, which is a huge win and like moral victory, I wind up having ideas that I'm excited about and I feel passionate about. So like I start to work on them. But they're not, it's not exclusively about money. I do feel passionate. They are values aligned, but the money is there. And so this feeling like I need to hustle, I think is one of the things that also gets in the way for me. And I know talking to I finally saw some friends this weekend, and I know from talking to them, like that's the grind culture, the hustle culture, like that also gets in the way, whether it's a real financial need or not, it's getting in the way. And I don't know what to do about
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I feel like I go through these waves of feeling like, okay, like, no, you have to hustle more or work more, like in this period. And then other times it's more like this is habitual
it.
and
Right.
like figuring out like which one is which.
Yes.
And
Yes.
like I remember in the past year having a lot of internal conversations around myself as like how much money do I actually need? Should I change jobs because this will help me work and live differently? Or like, you know, how much of this is hustle culture and how much of this is like my own unresolved issues
Right.
around money and finances. And I didn't feel like my parents talked about money in like the ways in which I talk to money with my own kids. Like I feel like that financial literacy was missing, or even like, you know, I feel like there's lots of people I know who like work multiple jobs or like whatever. And it's like some of it is about like, no, I need to make a certain amount of money, but some of it is just this hustle culture that tells us we need to keep doing more. And it's never enough,
It's never enough.
never enough. Yeah. And then capitalism weaves it capitalism weaves itself in um, with also like making it so that so many people can't earn enough from their job in
Right.
order to be able to satisfy their basic needs. And, think about like what kind of anxiety does that cause for people because they just don't have enough.
Totally. Totally. And then there's layers and layers upon not having enough. And there's so many shades of gray of not having enough, and like right that enoughness. Cause it's like, if I didn't have to save for my children's college, if I didn't have to, even that, if I didn't
Mm-hmm.
have to save, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I wasn't choosing to try to save money for my children's college, I think we would have enough. But I've got this idea that I do have to pay for my children's college, even if they take the loans at some point, that I do have to pay for it. And I want that. I think I genuinely want that. I should probably interrogate that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm like, wow, we need to make more money, because like what the financial powers that be tell us is required to do that is like not within the realm of possible right now. But even all of that, it's like the amount of deconstruction and interrogation that's required.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just so easy to fall asleep and then have all this pressure and then work to myself into oblivion and be sick and sad. And I'm like, oh, fucking A.
Mm-hmm.
Climb back out and understand what happened. And yeah.
But it's interesting because it's like, what's the environmental culture that is putting the pressure, right? Because I think about how much college cost when I went to undergrad. It was much cheaper than it costs now.
Oh my God.
And
Infinite.
yeah, I mean, I was able to leave undergrad without any debt, partly because I had a scholarship and partly because my parents could pay the rest. And I went to a state school, but like even that state school now is
Right.
like, it's more than double what it was back then. And even at the university I work at now, like I was in a director's meeting last week and somebody said, like a parent said, I pay $70,000 a year to come. And I was like, what? That's how much it costs to come here? Like, I'm just like, what is that? Like, how, like, that is not the average student. So then when I think about that anti-racism stuff, that's why these schools are predominantly white institutions, because like who's applying to these colleges, who's able to access it, who's able to pay for it, right? Like, I think that there's data that shows it's like the top percent of a certain social class, like who's getting admitted are the people in the higher socioeconomic statuses because they can afford
Right. Totally.
to go. Yeah.
And even the loans, it's like,
How
yeah,
are you
you're
going
gonna
to pay
pay
them
them back.
back?
Right. How are you gonna pay them back? And like even the thought and the intimidation of that, and the feeling of just sheer dread of even applying to get them, and the hoops and logistics that you have to go through to even apply.
Yes. I mean, I left grad school with tens of thousands of dollars of debt. And the only reason I was able to pay it off was a couple of years ago when there was the racial reckoning. Let's sign up for a lot of anti-racism trainings. And so I used that money, the anti-racism facilitator money, to pay off my student loans. Like it was an anomaly year,
Right.
probably never to happen again. And yet, in an average life, I wouldn't have been able to do that without sacrificing many other things.
Totally. Totally. Oh yeah. The advice I got from a financial advisor, probably 15 years ago, was like, let's consolidate as low as humanly possible so that you die with money that you haven't paid back. And like, that's the plan. I'm like, okay, sounds good to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because it's if we factored that on top, it's just the feeling of like you can never stop working.
Right.
Yeah,
Which is then why most people wouldn't buy into the ability to rest,
totally.
right? Because it's like, how are you going to do that, right? Because it's in some ways it's easier to rest if you have financial security, right?
That's
Like,
right.
right. And so even though we could argue that there's different kinds of rest, But like, how is the nervous system going to relax into rest if it's thinking like, how am I going to pay this bill? How am I going to take care of this thing? Like, how can I afford to go pay to see a doctor or go to therapy? Right? Like, how am I going to do these things that support my care if I'm not even making enough to meet my basic needs, or I'm skimming by, I'm living paycheck to paycheck, which I feel like I've spent the majority of my life living paycheck to paycheck.
Right.
And the years that I haven't had to do that, I feel the difference.
Right. Well, absolutely. Have you read Rest is Resistance or Rest
Mm-hmm.
is
Yeah.
Resistance?
Rest
Yes.
is resistance. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Trisha Hersey.
Yes. And so I was just telling you before we started recording, I pulled out that book and Cole Arthur Riley's book. What is the name of her book again?
This
This
Here
Here
Flesh.
Flesh. I've been feeling the need to reread both of those because I love how both of those women complicate the conversation about rest. Because what I keep coming back to is what Trisha Hersey says in her book is that rest is a birthright. And I know that and I believe that in my bones. And so what she talks about is like, how are we it's similar to what you were talking about in terms of your commute, right? Like how are we really intentionally using the time that we have? How are we being subversive? How are we being creative around pulling together pockets of time or being really intentional about the time that we have? And I love that. I love that so much. And so I want to sit with that more and think about what does that look like for me. But I've been feeling so invested in community care lately, which is something, again, that Cole Arthur Riley talks a lot about is this like resting in love or resting in community. And how do we create better systems so that one of us can just and then we've got this, army of people not letting all the balls drop. We're in this very toxic, individualistic society we live in. When I have to go kaput for a bit, either due to illness or just sheer fatigue or, mental health, whatever, lots of balls drop. And that only makes the recovery and the climbing out so much worse. And again, I sit in such a place of privilege. So the layers and what does this look like for people who have resources so much less than me, that have so much less privilege than me. It's just it's like fucking wild to think about. Oh,
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like I think so much about this community care and collective care and like what's my part in this. And yeah, I also sit in so much privilege because even those years that I was living, paycheck to paycheck, or like, I think they say like the average United States person like is only like a paycheck or two from, you know, not having enough. And like, but I had like parents or like people I could have reached out to help like if I needed it to. And so just thinking about how many people don't have those safety
right,
nets, right?
right.
Like there's no like, let me put it on a credit card and like pay it in a couple of weeks. There's none of that. And so how much of that is making our world sick or
Yes.
stressed or like shortening our lifespan, or how much are we, like one of the things I've been thinking about, like even in the month that I've been in this new job is, am I spending enough quality time with my kids? Like
Yeah.
they're teenagers, but like, and so I even checked in with them yesterday, like just because I was like, it feels like we're doing fine, but like, is the new job that has this commute that brings more financial security and brings me more joy in my work, like is the trade-off worth it, right? Like if I'm seeing my kids less, if I'm around less, um, and what have I been able to outsource, whether it's like my spouse is like now doing the cooking, or like, we have people who like mow our lawns, like, which all comes from privilege, right? Like the ability to outsource things that used to take a lot of time and energy from my life when my kids were younger, when we were like didn't have disposable funds to do that kind of stuff. And just thinking about how many people are drowning in all of the pressures of the to-do list. I
Right.
think at one of our first conversations on the
Uh-huh.
podcast, we were talking about like that to-do list that is never
Ending.
ending.
Never
Yeah.
ending.
Yeah. And like what is like would be nice and what is like required and like what is supportive of our families.
And the importance, like I think for me, part of this is like I just the falling asleep process. The name of the podcast is Rest and Awaken. And I think I've been largely asleep for a little bit now. And so it's that stopping to be intentional, because I know when I start to move fast, when everything starts to feel urgent, when I'm caught up in the to-do list, even just that morning pause of meditation is not enough to be like, I'm rushing through this to-do list, but like to what end? And what can I just be like, fuck that for a little bit? And like that ball is
Mm-hmm.
just gonna come crashing down, but you know what? It's made of plastic and it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
But like getting so caught up in like the lack of intentionality, and the tuning out of my body, and the getting caught up in distractions and in the hustle and grind of life, not taking that time to be intentional or to pause and be reflective. Like for me, I've got to start thinking about how do I incorporate that in a multitude of ways, right? Not just meditation at the beginning of my
Mm-hmm.
day. So in a multitude of ways, and not just once, because there are seasons where it's just not enough.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so but I have to take the time to stop and think about, like, what do I actually need? Because if I'm just caught up in the grind, then right, I'm just gonna spend every
Mm-hmm.
waking minute checking off shit on the to-do list, half of which probably doesn't matter.
Yeah, yeah. I had this thing of I used to have a regular on the mat yoga practice outside of my home. And yesterday I went to a yoga class in person, which is probably the first one this year and only the second one since the pandemic started.
Oh,
And
wow.
it was such an amazing class, like so amazing. And I was like, this is what I need, right? Like to go to this class once a week. I mean, it's great that it's on a Sunday so I can like start my week this way, and like to be with my breath, to be with my body, to be in community even though we're not talking to each other, and to move, to right, like this aging body that doesn't move the way it used to, and like but needs to move. And it felt so, even though it wasn't like, it was in a gym, so it wasn't like spiritually oriented, and yet it
And
felt
yeah,
spiritually oriented to me because on my four squares on my mat, like I dropped in and I was like, this is part of the rest, right? Because that, like the cardio and the strength training and all that stuff, that's all good, and yet there's something about the yogic practice, the asana, that has a different thing, and like it changed my day. And
totally.
so thinking about like what are these practices, I remember having a yoga teacher years ago who would talk about like how do we bring the monastic practices into our daily life, right? Like we're not living in a monastery, but like how do we make things more sacred? How do we slow down, like, and so she was saying like even making your kids lunch for school, like
Mm.
how do we make that
Ooh.
a spiritual practice, right? So
Oh, I
instead
love
of like, oh, it's day 100 of making this lunch,
another
like,
sunflower
right,
and jelly
right,
sandwich.
right. It's like, well, thinking about nourishing my kid, like, how can I bring love into this? How can I, like, the things that we do repetitively, how do we begin to like begin again? And like, we've never done it before, like in this body at this time, like how do we begin again? Like even with the commute, I could bring suffering into my daily commute, like or I can think about like, right, like, or how can I figure out how to bring some pleasantness to it, or make it like do something in it that is going to be supportive, and like where do I see that I have this choice? And like I think the other thing I think about for me is like I get asked to be like on committees or boards or whatever. And I remember, and usually I'm in a leadership position and I'm trying really hard to just be like a member. Like I don't have to be a leader. I can just be a member, right? Which is a muscle I'm trying to develop. And I was on this board of my church for 4 years. 2 of those years I was president and I never missed a meeting. And so the muscle I'm trying to develop this year is to be a member at large of this committee and to give myself permission to miss meetings
Love that.
because
Love
I
that.
have other things I need to do. And so like that like doesn't have to be perfection. I don't have to give 110%. That my participation at what I would consider like 75% is good enough, right? And if at some point it doesn't serve me, giving myself permission to leave,
Yep.
right? And I have to challenge the chatter that says like, that's not enough. Like you should be 110% all the time. And the part of me that used to be judgmental of other people who I thought were only giving 75%, right? And like that's part of the
Totally.
hustle culture. That's part of the white supremacy culture, right? This is like why maybe people don't try to be of service because it's just like one more burden on them.
100%. And I've got the opposite of that example. Because again, all roads lead back to baseball. Baseball is the bane of my existence in this season. But again, like I love my kids. They love baseball. So I'm like, okay, like trying to find my role. So I've been assistant coaching and it's not working for me for so many reasons. And my tendency is that lots of things don't work for me. And then I'm like, well, I'm going to now be in charge of it and build it in a way that works for me. And so I've been toying with this idea of like, am I a head coach? And I'm like, no, that's just like my knee jerk. Like, that's going to make it worse, whatever. But I've sat with it now since spring, and I'm a head coach of my daughter's team now. And like, time will tell whether this is a good decision or a bad decision. But I made it really intentionally, and I am doing it differently because the expectation of being any kind of coach in my community, especially for baseball, is that is 110%. And it does not fucking work for me. And so I'm doing it differently. And this, I'm like asking all of the parents to participate in some way instead of it's like 3 coaches and those 3 coaches have to show up to every practice and every game and da da da. I'm asking all the parents to participate in some way, if they are able, and have the bandwidth. And this allows me to mitigate. Baseball season is really the only time that I experience direct in your face sexism. I am constantly reminded as an assistant coach that like men don't really know what to do with me when I'm a baseball coach. And so to like take back some of that power in this strategic way, where I'm not interested in exerting power over, I'd like to share power in a more equitable way. That feels really good. And so I'll be curious to see how, but what came to me, Nathalie, what is this idea? I was like exhausted. We had our first game yesterday and I was exhausted afterwards and like whatever. And beating myself up for like, oh my God, I forgot to bring snacks, or like I'd wanted to bring music and whatever. And like it felt like this thought came and it was like, what if a B- is okay? What if like you can be head coach because you got to do all these things that work for you, but like we just are working for a B-. I was like, that's a radical idea.
Mm-hmm.
So the permission to like play, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to model that, right? Like that it's okay, right? Like the fundamentals happen.
Right. Right. We showed up, we played, we did the damn thing. Maybe that was all
Mm-hmm.
that's needed for the
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. Oh,
Mm. It's so hard. And I think like this idea that we have choice, like we can change the story, we can decide to do this differently, and that
different.
that muscle takes repetition.
Yeah. And even I don't know if you've experienced this because you're going through a lot of change too, but I've noticed that sometimes when the practices that I rely on most heavily, they that keep me awake, I think, they almost become so rote that they aren't
Mhm,
keeping me
mhm,
awake. And so the permission to change, like you said, I've been feeling quite lonely these last few months, again, baseball. Um, and I can't see my friends like every single day. We're all working mothers, you know.
mhm,
So I've been switching my meditation to talk to my ancestors. And I put their pictures in frames in my meditation spot. And that's been such a lovely change.
mm,
Yeah. And so just that one small tweak. Again, I think one of the things you and I talk about a lot is like it's so easy to be in the binary. And it's like if I've got to make a change, then I've got to throw away all the old stuff and
mhm,
start anew. Just this one simple tweak of like just picturing my ancestors and picturing my three female ancestors in particular, like holding hands and standing around a fire and like releasing all the shit that doesn't serve us and never served any of us. That's just been a really lovely switch that I feel like is making me
mm.
feel more awake and like more in community, you know?
Oh, I love that. Oh, I'm so glad that that practice is nourishing for you.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly borrowing from all the wisdom of other cultures and people who do this all the time, and it's just not that's not the model that
Mm,
I was raised with, and I'd like to make that different, for me and my kids.
yeah. Yeah, I've been because I had a little bit more time, or I'm trying to make more time for relationships. Like my spouse and I, we met at Rutgers, and so we have a lot of mutual friends from Rutgers, and it was our 25th um, reunion
Oh wow.
or anniversary. And so last Sunday, one of our friends, because most people who go to Rutgers are from New Jersey, so we a small group of us got together, and it was so lovely. Like there's a handful of them that I keep in touch with anyway, but others I haven't seen in many years, and I've been thinking a lot about like with this free time I have, which isn't a lot, but like, what are the relationships I want to cultivate? Right? It's not social media relationships, it's like in person time or even texting time. Like, there's these girlfriends that we last year started to do like monthly dinners together. And like, so I'm like, okay, how do I contribute to the text exchange, right? Like, what are the ways in which I'm building community? Because I too was so lonely last year. And like, it's like, what were the relationships I neglected or I let die or I didn't have time for? And I like just thinking about wanting to be a good ancestor and like, how do I make time for these relationships, even if it's just the text exchange, because I
Right.
won't see them for a couple more weeks? Or might I use some of my commuting time to call people? Like, well, that
Mm.
seems so weird to me. Like, call
It
people?
does.
Like it feels so
Like,
weird. I have to build
oh,
myself. I know, right? So I have one friend that we agreed that I was going to do it because we would meet once a month for like coffee or tea or something. But so it's like these things like, how can I make time
yeah.
for these relationships, right? Like I get to see you twice a month, right?
No,
And so like how do we make time, because the world will keep being busy and we'll keep telling ourselves we don't have the time, and then years go by and I'll wonder, oh, I miss that person, or whatever happened to that person, or why don't we keep in touch? But it's like, what's the part that I'm playing? And part of
yes,
that is dealing with the people who maybe aren't invested in nurturing the relationship and like feeling the feelings and spending time with other people.
totally. Absolutely. And even can't remember if you said this like on air or if it was before, but even you making time with your partner, right? Like, because I think we've got this idea that like, oh, we have families, we live with our partners and our children, like that must mean we're close to them, and it's like no, like being really intentional and honest about, are we just like doing all the things together, but that's different than quality time.
Yeah.
And for months, I mean, me and my kids, it's different. Like, oh, I feel like all we do, they're still little, all we do is quality time. All I do is watch them play baseball or coach them play baseball and then like set up play. Yeah, all we do is quality time. But like with Nick, there's been so little quality time because it's not just my friends that I can't see on the weekends. It's also Nick. He's 20 feet away coaching my son, but like I'm not interacting with them. And so even just waking up to that, like how can Nick and I carve out quality time? Because like cuddling in bed every night and like having dinner is not cutting it. If probably ever, but certainly not right now. It's not cutting it. So what does this look like to be more intentional about the people that I have these ideas that like, oh, I see you all the time, but like that's not the same.
Right.
It's not the same
Yeah.
quality
Yeah.
time.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was before we went on air, I was talking about how Chris and I, we had like a couples business meeting yesterday, and we're hoping to do it like maybe twice a month, because it felt like the last few weeks we were like two ships passing in the night. Like we're
Totally.
coordinating things, but it wasn't like
Right.
quality time. And over time in a relationship, there could be so much distance, emotional distance built in.
Right.
So like we actually I think spent like 90 minutes outside in our backyard
Oh,
just chatting, and like the check-in questions were around health, um our relationship, parenting, social stuff, and work. Those were like the five areas. And like we each checked in, and it was like I felt so much closer to him afterwards, like to just like to really talk, not in the like fly like, oh, do you want chicken for dinner tonight, like
right.
not in like that kind of task oriented, but in like what's bringing you joy, like what's hard, like how are you feeling,
Yes.
um and like how like that takes work to like build that in. And we could have gone on a date, but I don't know if we would have talked about those meaningful parts of our life.
That's right. That's such a good point. Yes. Nick and I have been talking about this too, where we're like date night, date night, date night, but date nights are really hard right now because so many of the people that my daughter struggles with some anxiety and specifically separation anxiety. So she's fine separating from us, but when we go from her, especially me, it's a lot harder. So all of the people that she's closest with for babysitters just went back to college. We've got new people in the fold, but she's not yet comfortable. So we're trying to make that happen, but it's there's a rub. And so it's like at some point, instead of like just continuing to like fight the fight, it's like stop, reevaluate, get creative. How do we subvert this problem? We make a date day or we go out to breakfast in the morning and like take take an hour before our day starts, or usually after the kids go to bed, we're too tired. But right, like how else? We have a home that we love being in. Um, right. Like we can be close in ways that don't involve dates.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's lovely. And again, that's just the creativity when like the systems are not working. How do you just stop and pause and reevaluate rather than just like continue to fight systems that are working against you?
Right.
Or
Yeah.
both, or both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah.
August.
Yeah. September. Right around the
September.
corner. We'll have to check in a couple weeks and see how it's
Yeah.
going.
Right. I know. I'm going to be like, things are going to be getting better for me as things possibly might be getting worse for you. So
Yeah.
timing will hopefully work out.
Well, it's
Seem
always
like
a pleasure.
always a pleasure. All right. Talk to you soon.
Yeah. Feel better.
Thanks. Talk soon. Bye.
Bye.